additions to the agenda at this point? Okay, thank you. Staff report. Is there a staff report at this time? Not at this time. Let's see. Brandon, did you want to make a report, comment on the public workshop at this point? Okay. All right. The approval of minutes is not the next, is this next thing to discuss? Okay. Heather made a motion, seconded by Lynn Barnes. Those in favor of approving the minutes of the previous meeting as our correction?
Yeah, actually, if I could point out, I think I have 3 very small corrections. One is a name correction. One of the other people present, one of the members of the public who spoke, the correct name is John Bambenek. I think it's B-A-M-B-E-N-E-K. B-A-M-B-E-N-E-K, I think is the correct spelling for that member of the public who spoke. His name was under the Carl Foundation Hospital public input section and up at the top. The second very small correction, if other people remember it this way, was that the people who spoke at the top of page 2 about the Carl thing, it said here in the way the minutes were sent to us that the following people addressed the committee in opposition to the proposed expansion plans. But I think to be more fair to those 3 people and all the things they said, it would be better off saying the following people addressed the committee with concerns about aspects of the proposed hospital expansion plans. We really heard a lot of detailed things, and some were concerns about parts. I think that's more fair of a record of their comments. Okay. The third very small change is under item 7 on the middle of page 2, the public speaker, Christy Nugent, who came to talk. She addressed the committee in support of this topic, and I'd like to add a little more description, and requested city support for placing solar panels in the setback of her yard. I think that was really one of her driving issues for being there, and I just wanted to record that. Those are my corrections that I would suggest.
Does the motioner and the seconder accept those corrections as stated? Okay. All right. So is there a motion? Oh, okay. We've had a motion to approve the minutes, and then we've had a correction to them. Those in favor of approving those minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And opposed? Okay. The minutes of the previous meeting are approved. We have about 7 different requests for public comment. First, I'll ask about Scott Hockman and Jeff Edwards. I'm not sure if you want to speak at this time or at the time of the item concerning the Visitors Bureau information presentation. At the time of the item. Okay, I'll hold those. Okay, I'll hold those aside. Let's go to George Carlisle. Speaking in favor of not changing the smoking ban is apparently the topic he'd like to present.
George Carlisle, 406 East Green, Urbana, just east of your Battle Block. Yeah, this is very late breaking, according to what was in the headlines of tonight's paper about the leveling of the playing field between the 2 cities. If Champaign decides to repeal the smoking ban, as Deborah Frank Fine and Karen Foster are trying to do, and some of the bar owners here in Urbana are complaining that they're losing business too, like the Champaign was. But as I said in tonight's paper, now that Deborah Frank Finan and Karen Foster have been elected to the Champaign City Council, we face the threat that the anti-smoking ordinance in Champaign could be repealed. This is a serious concern to members of the CU Smoke Free group, who have fought very hard for several years to get smoking banned in bars and restaurants in both cities. They have a website where they post the most articles that appear in the paper. Mine should probably be in there, if not today, by tomorrow. There are people who like to go to such places to hear jazz bands play, but are sensitive to tobacco smoke themselves and cannot tolerate breathing the polluted air. for health reasons, it is in the public interest that there not be secondhand smoke in public places. I urge all Champaign residents to urge council members, Deborah Frank Fine and Karen Foster especially, not to support repeal of the smoking ban. I urge the threat of a boycott of Champaign bars and restaurants if smoking is allowed inside those establishments. And if the Urbana ordinance is repealed, I would have to say I'd encourage boycott there until they wake up to the fact we should not have smoking in this place. With the weather warming up, smokers should be able to smoke outside in designated smoking areas near these places, but they must not foul the air of those that choose not to smoke or cannot tolerate tobacco smoke for health reasons. I also urge both cities to strongly consider levying a substantial increase in cigarette taxes to discourage especially university students from buying cigarettes. They're the number one avoidable health hazard. We cannot afford to let Champaign be a smoky city again. We certainly can't afford to let Urbana be a smoky city again. We must do all we can to make sure that the anti-smoking ordinance remains in effect. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Comments for Mr. Carlisle? Okay. There are two other people who would like to speak before the item comes up in the regular course of the agenda. First, Carolyn Baxley, speaking on historic preservation incentives.
Hi, I live at 510 West Main. I'm just here to say congratulations. I've lived in Urbana for 33 years, and I didn't think I'd ever see historic preservation placed on an agenda for the City Council. And those of us who spent a lot of time and money and a great deal of energy trying to preserve our built environment are very appreciative that the Council is going to be looking at this. I think the incentives that I read about in the packet are all worth exploring. Some of the ones from other cities are very good as well. And I would like to say, though, that the first step in historic preservation is to try to prevent further demolition of the existing built environment. Urbana doesn't have a very good track record in that regard. You've lost 2 major historic structures in the last 5 years, and a lot more before that. We have very little of our downtown left compared to some other cities our size in the state. So I would urge you, as you're beginning to think about incentives, financial incentives, to also consider some type of moratorium on demolition in the areas where you know there are structures that are worth saving. And I'm sure that the Preservation Association could be of great help in that regard. But I just wanted to say it's great, and thank you. I had other things I have to go to tonight, but I wanted to speak and give you all a pat on the back. Thanks very much.
Questions for Carol? Brandon?
Yeah, thanks, Carol, for coming and speaking about this. I wonder, you've been a key part of some of the historic rehab projects in this city and Champaign. Have you taken advantage of some of the existing programs for the property tax freeze and those, and do you think there's good awareness of those existing tools?
We have taken advantage of them. The city's facade loan programs, some TIF funds for the cinema theater, and we have taken advantage of the 10% federal tax incentive program, and actually have saved quite a bit on our taxes in that regard, because generally we have something going on in any given year, and it's very expensive to do this rehab, so we've been able to take advantage of that. And the money from the city that the city's made available through the facade loans and whatever has been very, very helpful to us. And I'm thinking that if you add to that incentives for landmarking, it may ensure more of a participation in the process. I think there are a lot of people in town who live in historic houses who might consider landmarking them if they thought there was going to be some benefit to doing so. The other big educational hurdle is to convince people that you don't have to be rich to engage in historic preservation. There's a misconception that that's only for the very wealthy or people who can afford to have the restrictions placed on them. That is not true, and there's a lot of help that's available to them through local community resources and a lot of people who are willing to help them. Yes, I mean, that's a long answer to your question, but we definitely have benefited from those programs.
And a sort of follow-up question, my last question is, one of the trade-offs I think that we'll come to discuss later tonight is the issue of, do we just have programs more like other cities that give people only an incentive at the time they actually do a rehab? If they spend enough money restoring a facade, then we'll help. Or do we give people incentives right at the time of nominating the landmark? Because there don't seem to be any existing incentives at that step. And I guess you had sort of hinted at that, but what's your feeling about which of those kinds of incentives at this point are more valuable to people and are what would make the difference?
Well, Brendan, I think I would need to think a little bit more about that. I'm not as familiar with incentives in other cities as I would like to be, and I appreciate staff's summary of some of those. There are probably others that could be ferreted out as you move forward in this process, but incentives, no matter when they come, whether it's when you do it or property tax freezes, saving on building permits. I mean, every little bit.
Well, the owner was not in favor of it, I guess.
No, we had some.
You had some that people
Yes,
participated happily.
we were in the first five. We had our two downtown buildings, 115 and 120, 324 West Main, but we also had a residence at 108 North Weber. That was the first wave, in addition to the Ricker House, which PACA did. There was owner objection, I believe, over the first historic district, the two properties. I believe there was some resistance to that.
The Royal House. Okay. Thank you.
But, yeah.
Yes, Mayor.
Could you please tell us what the two properties were that were demolished in the last 2 years, or 5 years, you said?
Well, it wasn't totally within the city's control, but the Ader Jakes house could have been saved in situ, and it was not. I felt that that was a real loss, particularly since the city was the steward of the house, and the sheriff's residence on Main Street. I realized that was a county property, but I think also there more could have been done to encourage the preservation of that structure. But I mean, that was probably more out of your control than the Jakes house, but those were significant losses to the whole downtown fabric. So I hope we don't see any more of those.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. And
disentangle myself here.
Yeah, leave us our equipment, please.
Oh, yes.
The other person who'd like to speak before the agenda items come to bear is Brian Adams. Also on the topic of historic preservation incentives.
My name is Brian Adams. I live at 412 West Elm Street in Urbana, and I've jotted down some notes here I'd like to read, but in general I just want to say that I strongly support the incentives that have been proposed as discussion. I strongly support the idea of establishing economic incentives to encourage more individuals to nominate historic buildings for landmark status. From personal experience, I know that the renovation and maintenance of older buildings is a costly undertaking, and the type of incentives proposed could encourage more people to acquire such buildings for renovation and save them from the wrecking ball. I also strongly support the creation of a special historic landmark fund to provide additional incentives to encourage more historic landmark nominations. Researching the architectural and historic background of a building can be a labor-intensive and tedious process, requiring much time and dedication. While a building's architecture alone might be reason enough for landmark designation, often the history associated with such a building can be just as significant. Reconstructing the significant historic events associated with a particular building requires much research, as completion of the landmark nominations recently submitted by myself and Ilona Motkowski for the Freeman and Sutton houses at 502 and 504 West Elm Street demonstrate. While these nominations required several months of tedious research spread over a couple of years' time, the results of this research were incredibly rewarding, not only for us, but also, we feel, for the city of Urbana. In the case of the Sutton House, all Champaign County newspapers in the archives of the Urbana Free Library between 1880 and 1890 were meticulously examined to reconstruct the history of that building, which turned out to be the mansion built by the widow of Royal Sutton, former mayor of Urbana and the brick king of Champaign County. He used to have some brickyards up on the, roughly where the new Walgreens went up. In the case of the Freeman House, our research revealed that the architect of that building was none other than Urbana's own Joseph W. Royer. Until we submitted our nomination, the architect of this neoclassical gem was unknown. Encouraging people to conduct such research can not only help us rediscover much of the existing unique history that still surrounds us in the form of historic structures, but can also help us make intelligent decisions when debating whether or not to permit the demolition of a particular building. So clearly there's a lot of available information right here in town that can help us identify those architecturally and historically significant structures that are potentially eligible as local landmarks. We just have to encourage more people to get out and search the records, and I believe the creation of a historic landmark fund is a step in the right direction. Thank you.
And are there questions for Brian? Yes, Danielle.
Yeah, thanks for your time coming out this evening. I have a couple of questions. The first is, I know that, Brian, you were involved in restoring your house at on Elm Street. And in looking at the different incentives that already exist, as well as some of the things that we're looking at doing as a city, I'm curious, with the state incentives, did you participate or take advantage of any of those state incentives? Did you know about them? And if you didn't take advantage of them, what was the barriers to taking advantage?
We didn't really know about them. When we bought that house, we had rented up until that point, so it was all new to us. And I think we really didn't realize what we were getting into when we initially got into the renovation process, and it was only by sort of working our way through the realities of renovation that we sort of became aware that there was help out there, but we by that point we were already well into ownership of the house and well into renovation. So we never pursued it probably the way we should have, but knowing now what we know, we probably would have been more on the ball and would have been a little bit more careful about looking into that.
Okay, and my second question is, of the sale price of the home, and I'm not asking you necessarily to share that, but of the sale price that you bought it at, what percentage of that price did you end up reinvesting in the house to do the preservation work that you've done?
Probably right now about 50%. It's been quite a chunk of money.
Yeah, that sounds like it.
Other questions? Yes, Charlie.
Yeah, follow up with you, Brian. So, you know, we've got a stack of brochures, you know, the 5 or 6 different ones on various agencies and programs and whatnot that are out there. And I suspect that most people don't know that those things exist. What would you suggest for as a mechanism to make that, you know, make whatever new programs we might add plus the existing programs known to the world?
That's a good question. Like I said, we didn't really realize it until we bought our house and we started to look around us, and we became aware of the architectural and historic environment that we lived in. And it was only by word of mouth, really, that we learned about some of the pamphlets and other things that were out there. So I don't know. I'd have to think about that. That's a good question. I'd really have to think about how to. I know the information's there. It's just, but I'd have to give some thought how to reach people.
Yeah, I've you know, this will be something for community development to tackle, and
Sure.
and I think one thing in the notes that we got tonight, there's a little bit of a flow chart that's developed. I thought maybe that might be the beginning of it. I don't know if you've seen that flow chart.
No.
Okay, I don't know if it's on the counter, or I can show you
Okay.
before you leave.
Okay.
But it is on the city webpage.
Okay.
For tonight's agenda, you can pull out just that document, and it's in there.
Oh, okay.
But there's a little flow chart of what can happen, but it's very sketchy.
Well, that would be one way, is to put it online. And have
Well, all the pamphlets are online at this point, I
Okay.
think.
Okay.
But there's no overview,
Yeah.
really, I don't think, yet.
Maybe a document like that, a general document alerting people that there are these things out there and that there's a place to go to. I'd have to think about it.
Other questions for Brian?
Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right. Is there any other person who needs to speak before we begin the regular agenda? All right. That closes this part of public input. Next, we have a presentation, which is an overview, I think, of the results of the Big, Small, and All. And we have Frank DeNovo, who will do it for us. I trust.
I always make that mistake and hit the sorter instead. Well, I'm really pleased to be able to speak tonight to so many participants in the Big Small All process. I was just going over the participant list, and almost everyone here was involved in some way or other. This is a rather extraordinary project, which was the result of an unprecedented initiative in Champaign County, Big Small All, which brought together more people in with a wider reach than anything that we've attempted since the town meeting for tomorrow in 1976. Was an extraordinary effort to bring people together in a dialogue. It was carefully structured as a dialogue process. Throughout the process, at various points, people asked me if they could just email their comments in, and my response generally was no. We didn't want people on the sidelines tossing in their ideas. We wanted them to sit at a table with their neighbors and enter into a process of dialogue. And part of the purpose of this is to achieve a greater sense of mutual understanding and find those threads of common values and common thinking in the community. The underlying purpose of this is to enable us to move forward more effectively, which requires a clarity of vision, getting a good understanding of what it is that you want and how to get it, a unity of purpose, which is one of the key things in a community as diverse as this, to get people behind a common agenda, and lastly, to develop a commitment to action. And Big Small All was constructed because these things in a large community are not going to emerge spontaneously. This is something that has to be consciously constructed, and that's what Big Small All was set up to do. There wasn't any crisis in the community that led to this. I think you're all sort of familiar with the kind of general sets of concerns out there that I've summarized here, leading generally to a sense that we were lacking in momentum here, and that other communities were out-competing us. And we needed to work better together in order to generally be more competitive. So the dialogue was constructed with three principal characters that it needed to achieve. It needed to be strategic. It needed to look far into the future. It needed to look across the entire community. It needed to be free of the limitations of any organization's powers or budget or legal authority, so that people could dream big dreams in the process. It needed to be inclusive. Everyone had to be at the table, and it needed to be purposeful. The point of this was not to just talk, but to actually move people to constructive action. So in order to undertake that and achieve those objectives, we undertook an unprecedented outreach effort that included a substantial amount publicity. I regret that I don't have a picture of one of the bus boards. I just have a billboard shot. For my money, I think the bus boards were a better media buy. It seemed like I couldn't go anywhere in town without seeing one of them. But apart from this, we had radio and television, PSAs. We distributed over 20,000 flyers. We sent the steering committee out to make as many contacts in the community as they could, and made many phone calls, appearances before different bodies to organize support and interest in the project. This was done rather quickly. We signed the contract with the consultant, ACP, in August, and we had our first public meetings in November. So we did a tremendous amount of work in a relatively short period of time in order to get people involved. And we were exceeded beyond our expectations. Over 680 people participated in the initial round of community dialogue meetings that we held at various places around the county. The little dots on there are stars that indicate the locations of the meetings. There were 10 of them altogether. The shading represents the overall levels of participation in those meetings relative to population. So we had very good participation from throughout the county, with the exception of the far northern corners. In fact, some of the outlying areas had some of the highest participation rates, although that's relative to a low population base. In other terms, we were initially pretty successful, I think, in terms of the sort of ethnic makeup of the community. Where we had problems or where we expected to have problems, where these sorts of processes always run into difficulties, and that was with low-income households and young adults, and specifically aged 25 to 34. Those were the two groups that were significantly underrepresented throughout the process. And as a whole, the participants in the process were older, had higher incomes, and considerably more education than the median in the county. And if you're curious about what the actual participation was, if you go to the website and look at Appendix B, it's detailed for each of the meetings, or most of the meetings that we had. But out of that process, I mean, there was still a remarkable level of participation and a broad representation in many ways. We came up with these 2,222 ideas that we later grouped into first 10 and then an 11th topical committee that worked on those ideas to elaborate a dozen goals and 68 objectives, each of which had an action strategy. Now, those topical committees, and some of you were participating in them, did the real hard work. That extended from March through August of last year, and it was a tremendous amount of difficult work and not always entirely pleasant. But the yeoman work really provided the foundation for going forward, which we took to what we call the Community Choices Workshop in October. Actually, there were 3 of them. There was the main effort was held at the Assembly Hall, and we had another one at the Civic Center here and another one up in Rantoul. And here we tested the results that came out of the topical committee work and encouraged people to critically evaluate those, vote for their priorities, and then indicate objectives and action strategies that the committees had come up with that they had reservations about. Those results were then taken by the steering committee, and they sorted through them. They initially made the first cut was to go forward only with those objectives they had gotten at least 5% of the maximum possible priority votes that they might have gotten. Then we had, through the process, allowed different committees to go their own ways with different ideas, so that at the end of the day, we actually wound up with several overlapping sets of objectives. We had 4 different objectives developed by 3 different committees, all of which addressed sprawl, essentially, or farmland conversion in one way or another. So those were combined, and that led us eventually to the 35 objectives and 145 action strategies that are contained in our Future Here, the vision document. Now that's organized around 5 themes: collaborative, prosperous, sustainable, supportive, and enriching. These were not invented a priori. These were found in the objectives, and they did seem to naturally divide themselves into these 5 themes, and this enabled us to produce a one-sentence version of the vision. Champaign County will be a place that is collaborative, prosperous, sustainable, supportive, and enriching. The collaborative theme really speaks to all of our concerns about being able to work together cooperatively and effectively and with mutual understanding and respect for one another. And I won't read all of these, but that's the gist of what those specific objectives address. I would point out that a couple of those are actually inserted by the steering committee. They did not come out of the topical committees for a couple of reasons. The way that the topical committees were structured led people to look in certain categories. And so there were themes that had emerged, that we knew had emerged in the community dialogue meetings that hadn't been picked up by the steering committee. County identity is the first one. It just didn't fall easily into a set of concerns that showed up in front of any given community or committee, but it was clearly there throughout the community dialogues. And the tolerant community objective was another one of those, which came up in different contexts in different committees, but not with sufficiently salient in any committee's list of objectives or ideas that they were working with for them to pick up on it. So the steering committee felt that those things should be carried forward because they came out of the process, but they just sort of fallen through the cracks between the committees. The prosperous objectives, of course, go to all of the things that we're concerned about in terms of ensuring that people can find good jobs, that businesses can prosper, that the university can remain globally competitive, and so on. The sustainable theme picks up on a range of concerns from building convivial and sustainable neighborhoods through environmental issues and park and open space issues. Supportive addresses all of those things, the concerns that we have to ensure that every individual has their basic needs met so that they can go forward and be full and active participants in the larger life of the community and live a fulfilling life. And lastly, enriching touches on all of those things that make life worth living and that are focused on allowing people to live rich and full lives. So having constructed this, and the full vision, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, is 44 pages. It's available on the website. I could also provide copies on CD if anyone would like them. I don't have them with me now, but I can get you one. So that's where the vision is. We have structured this process from the beginning as a community initiative, not as a government project. It was funded as a public-private collaborative effort, about two-thirds of the funding coming from local government and one-third coming from the private sector. And the idea was that this is really about an expression of an agenda for the entire community rather than any one institution or organization. So we're at the point now where, so what? How do we make this happen? What do we do? And we have had a couple of groups step forward to take on a couple of the objectives already. One of the top objectives that came out of the process was the urban growth, what we called urban growth and farmland resources. It was also the most controversial one, and it has to do with farmland conversion and the growth of the community. It was a very controversial and difficult one, and the Farm Bureau has adopted that as one of their projects, and they're going forward with the primary action strategy to start developing specific recommendations for policy that would be oriented towards encouraging more infill and denser, more contiguous development. The Regional Planning Commission has stepped up to deal with one of the strategic thinking objective, which starts out with developing a set of indicators for each of these 35 objectives, so that we have a baseline measure and we can track our progress with respect to each of these objectives as we go forward. Beyond that, the Big Small All will continue in an informal manner. It's not incorporated. It really exists only as a sort of mutual commitment between its participating organizations. But the Regional Planning Commission has made a small amount of money available to provide some ongoing staffing, and we do intend to keep working with the steering committee as soon as they're fully rested and have recuperated from this effort. And our focus will be on recruiting people. Our intent is not to just remain passive and hope that people adopt the objectives, but to actually go out and work with organizations and recruit people to take on objectives that people aren't working on. And we'll continue to work to promote it, to coordinate efforts, and I think very importantly to continuously report on what's going on so that everyone knows about Big Small All, what's happening with the implementation of the vision, and we keep it in front of people's consciousness. But at the end of the day, it's really going to be about individuals stepping up either on their own or as part of an organization, especially as part of an organization. And we're happy to work with anybody that is interested in any of these objectives. And it's really up to all of the citizens of Champaign County to make this happen. So I'd be happy to hear from anybody along those lines. And with that, are there any questions?
Frank, thanks for your presentation. I was pretty involved in the process and served on the Arts and Entertainment Committee, and I went to a lot of the different meetings. And I think that it was a phenomenal opportunity for folks who generally don't talk to each other to talk to each other. And so that kind of collaboration and communication, I think, is a kind of intangible that comes out of it, but that's really important. That said, I think I did get a chance while I was on the plane to read through this entire document, and I think that what's curious to me is the extent to which I felt like somehow between kind of the three-quarter step where we had the community assemblies and there was fairly specific proposals to this document, which I feel somehow, as I read through it, I felt like things were missing. There wasn't a specificity. Like all of a sudden, my opinion of this document is that something got watered down in the process. I don't know exactly how that happened, but I'm curious to get your input. In particular, looking at the document, I felt like I was looking for action items like establish a regional airport, like came out of the town halls in the 70s. Some very specific showing vision and leadership kinds of concrete things, like let's establish a technology backbone like Philadelphia has, like, you know, even Homer is doing, and other things, like let's do some things, some kind of bricks and mortar things. And instead I felt like this document asked for frequently, let's have another layer of bureaucracy, let's hire a new staff member, etc. And so that was a concern. And the other piece of the document was, let's study it more. Let's talk, let's collaborate. And I'll just give some examples. I guess I am leading up to a question at the end of this, but the first is, so for the technology infrastructure, the outcome is study it. And instead I feel like we've studied it, we're a high-tech community, and somehow we haven't gotten on board yet to build a public backbone that the private, the sector can then benefit from, as well as the public sector. And so I had expected something with the racial tolerance piece, which I really feel actually that piece demonstrates such a lack of vision on the part of our community to the issue of race and race politics. In that it's basically 2 sentences that says we have many techniques and we should do a survey and we should have a panel of stakeholders. And I just feel like, again, I'm not blaming you. I'm talking about what happened in this document such that this set of specific things turns into this. With the arts, in the Arts and Entertainment Committee, which I served on, the #1 pick at the community forum was a dedicated revenue stream for artists, money to artists. In this community, for some reason, we have an allergy to this, but the people spoke up and they said, let's fund artists and keep them in this community. And then I look at and that was the language that came out that was quoted in the News Gazette. And then I look at the document and it's, where did the dedicated public revenue stream go? Instead, we're talking about services that are supportive to artists and nurture the geographic nexus, but it's kind of like we lost something really concrete that was important in that. And then with healthcare, this is the last kind of example I'll give, we talk about wanting dialogue, awareness, and information. Well, we have a healthcare crisis in this county. Everyone talked about this during the Big Small All, and yet we're not imaginative enough to come up with some concrete alternatives. It does mention Francis Elson Health Center. I think that's one of the most visionary things that has come out of dialogues that weren't necessarily related to this. But I guess my question to you is, did you observe this phenomenon as well? And what exactly happened such that we went from having some pretty specific things, and I would say in the sustainable, the sustainable county, we have real goals in that section. That goal talks about zero waste. It talks about reducing 25% of our energy consumption in 30 years, etc. But the rest of the sections, they don't really have that kind of specificity, and so I somewhat kind of suspect, like, what kind of meat grinder did it go through, and how did it get to this point?
Well, the only editing that we did, actually, of the results. I mean, this is essentially what came out of the topical committees. Where we discarded things was when it was even more vague than this. There was one objective that said provide access to health care, and we deleted it. I mean, it was a meaningless statement. This is clearly a phenomena that we observed and that we discussed throughout this process. It was interesting to watch. I mean, there was one person in the community that was on the steering committee, very much involved, really wanted a zoo, really wanted somebody to say, we need to build a zoo. What came back was, we need to conduct a study to find out what kind of attraction people in Champaign County want. In some ways, I think this is a kind of a Rorschach test that tells you something about the character of the community. I think it's important to know that over 45% of the participants in this project had a master's degree or more education. So you had a lot of participants that were very comfortable dealing with abstract concepts and very aware of all of the different, in a sort of an abstract theoretical sense, nuances there were to some of the issues. And so this is sort of how we think about things here. We're very intellectual about it. I was looking at a vision that came out of another community in the Midwest, and one of their things was every child in our city is going to be bilingual. It's just, that's not a college. That wasn't a college town. It's a blue collar working-class industrial city. And there's something about the character of the place, or at least what this kind of a process can reveal about the character of the place. Should be careful to qualify that. This Big Small All is one way of looking at the community. It's not by any means the only means of understanding the place. But there really is a real dimension to that, and some of it is good. I mean, it is thoughtful. It is cognizant of the larger issues. Sometimes it fell down. There was one objective where it was really about doing a county-wide comprehensive plan. But it was stated in exquisite detail of all of the dimensions of these needed to be electronically interoperable, and there's this very long, elaborate statement going way around Robinson's barn to get to the point of we need a county-wide comprehensive plan. Well, that one didn't make the cut. It didn't make 5%. If it had just come out and said we need a county-wide comprehensive plan, it probably would have been one of the top vote getters. But because of the awkward, I mean, it was in some ways overthought, I think. And that happened despite our advice that the poetry was probably more important than working out all of the detail and making sure that it was all perfectly consistent and technically correct. So we were observing that process happening, but we had committed ourselves to letting the community assembly, as we called it, which was the topical committees, work their own way through this. I mean, this was not something that we wanted to impose. It was something that we wanted to let come up. And this is what came up. Now, I think that the other thing that we observed was that people had less technical knowledge in these subject areas than we thought. Or the people that participated in the topical committees oftentimes weren't really in a very good position to say, well, okay, how do we improve access to health care in Champaign County? What should we do? What's job one? I mean, and I think in retrospect, this sounds odd for a process that was intended to be inclusive and democratic, but I think we should have been more disciplined and exerted more control over who was on the topical committees. Because for those committees to do what we were asking them to do, they needed a lot more expert knowledge. And we did solicit people, but a third of the people that signed up to serve on committees never came to a committee meeting. And we were very reluctant, after having set these committees up and after having allowed people to sort themselves out into the areas that they were interested in, to then go back and reshuffle them. So we let the people that chose to participate in it shape the result. And we could have used a different design, but the combination of that decision with the design of the process, the way we had set it up, meant that this outcome was going to be what it was. Now, having said that, I think there is a lot in here to work with. I don't think it got us as far down the road as we might have liked to have gone, but it certainly pointed the direction. And I think it certainly establishes a pretty clear idea of the priorities. I mean, there's some really quite remarkable results here. I thought it was remarkable that the word global warming didn't come up in the whole process. And from that, that's important. That tells us that is not on people's minds. When the people that are concerned about the environment tend to focus more on natural areas.
Other questions? Mayor?
I would have to say that if the discussion were taking place today, that you would get a lot of discussion on global warming, because it's just hit the press much more than it was when this was being discussed.
Probably.
And it would come up under sustainable.
Charlie Smythe.
Yeah, and yet if you look at the sustainable section, it has some of the most concrete results of all of the sections, and all of these would go to reducing global warming. So I think the recognition, the people who put these together are beyond global warming. They know what needs to be done to achieve a zero carbon footprint. And I think that's what a lot of these items address. On the other hand, some of these things are just not based in reality. You look at the air service component here, and as much as we'd like to have to be the regional, the premier regional air service hub, we've already lost that. We lost it years ago when we ceded that to Bloomington Normal. Okay, and they've got AirTrans or whatever AirTrans is going to become. And we don't. They've got the low prices. They've got the free parking. They've got the county subsidy of their parking, and ours is very short-sighted. I don't know that we're going to be able to ever catch up. They've got such a jump. So some of these things just, like I said, aren't based in any kind of reality that I can see. On the other hand, a lot of these have some specific. A lot of them are just fluffy. They're feel-good fluff pieces. There's a lot there, and I think it might be more valuable to me as a government official to go back to the three-quarter step that Danielle is saying and look at what some of those concrete things were that people were saying and see how those actually match with the City of Urbana's comprehensive goals. And so we have, a lot of these things, if you look through here, a number of these fit in with our own city goals. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at those, but that's a comparison that I think would be worthwhile for me. But like I said, I'd like to go back and look at what was coming out of the three-quarter stuff. Finally,
the 2,200 ideas, you mean?
No, the three-quarter step. I said the
community assembly piece and the set of objectives that were presented at the community assembly.
The 68.
Yeah, and then the ones that rose to the top in the priority list. But you can get that off the website.
Yeah, that might be more valuable to me as I try to figure out what should we, which leads me to my final question which is, okay, we've got this, maybe it's a feel-good piece, maybe it's got some real ideas to it. How do we distill this down into real concrete action items that are actually worth pursuing? And one way that I come back to that is that, how do these mesh with the City of Urbana's current goals and how, as we go to revising those goals in the years to come, how would these fit in? I think that's the place that we would try to take on some of these ideas. But as a representative of a certain part of Urbana, why should I pursue some of these things? Some of these things have nothing to do with, the neighborhood I represent, for example.
Well, the reason that this was structured on a county-wide level, and that made it much more ambitious to try to construct a vision for 190-odd thousand people spread across 1,000 square miles. You've got a much more varied population base there, but the underlying logic of that was compelling. The county is much more representative of the regional economy in terms of the sense of what's the media market, what's the labor market, what's the housing market. Clearly, in an environmental context, environmental issues. I mean, every person that drinks water in Urbana needs to be concerned about an aquifer that extends across the large part of the eastern half of Illinois and possibly into Indiana. So the part of this project was to find, and one of the reasons why the statements may not be as compelling as they might otherwise be, is that Champaign County is perfectly purple. It's perfectly purple, and so there are lots of different perspectives that people had to come to, and so what the document contains are formulations that lack our definition of broad support, we were after broad support, and our definition of it was formulations that lack concerted opposition. So what we have here are ideas, are directions that we believe, coming out of the process, are ones that where there isn't going to be concerted opposition. Now, are you going to be able to make dramatic change in a short period of time by pursuing these things? Probably not. But we can make forward progress in a lot of areas where we have just been at loggerheads for decades, in a modest way, but there is a sense of this is a way that we can move forward. Now, there's a lot that remains to be done to figure out how to take these objectives and realize them. We've tried, working with the material that came out of the committees to suggest the ways that we can move forward, and even to call out a starting place. Now, that starting place is often about more talking, but that's in the context of not being entirely clear about what exactly needs to be done or how to go about doing it. And that talking is, in almost every instance, about identifying the specific things. So you take the urban growth and farmland resources one. That talking is directed to, we wouldn't have expected this process to say, well, this specific provision of the city's subdivision ordinance should be changed to encourage more compact development. I mean, that wasn't going to come out of the visioning process. But
Frank, maybe perhaps the working on the solution to fix big, small, and all is best done not during the city council meeting. However, I think some of the issues that are being brought up are totally relevant. I wonder if it might be very intriguing to get an addendum sheet of the 30 most interesting topics that didn't make the cut. And that would be an interesting read, perhaps, to see ideas that surfaced but didn't quite get accepted in the final report. That
those appear in Chapter 2 as other ideas.
Other ideas.
Under each of the themes.
Okay, so there is a resource there for thinking further, perhaps.
And if you go to the website and you look at Appendix E, it will show you exactly what happened to the 68 objectives, which ones got combined and how they got edited.
Everything's on the CD, right?
Yeah, and that's all in the CD as well.
Well, I think it's important for the community to hear and to assimilate the results of this very extensive process, which started, as I recall, I mean, certainly I participated in the initial steps, in an individual classroom at the junior high school, I think it was, or one of the locations, with a small group of about 8 people, and we came up with, a list of, we went through a very interesting process that gave us a list of action ideas, and it went on from there and snowballed into a larger assembly, and now has ended up into a interesting directive for the community. Yes, Lynn?
I just have one comment, and having served on the steering committee for the last half of the process, I think it was, I think, keep in mind, it was a tricky job for the steering committee to come up with a document that was, I mean, it's not like we were going for consensus, but, that we thought reflected the most of what we heard, and also to maybe leave in some of those various other ideas that are out there. You know what I mean? It's a balance. And so I think the document that you see has its high points in terms of clarity, where there seemed to be a lot of kind of maybe general consensus, and it also has maybe weaker areas because there was maybe less consensus about what should be done in those areas. So I just wanted to share with you my thoughts on that.
Excellent. Other comments? Danielle?
Since I have 2, I'll take both of my 2 comments. I think this merits discussion because I strongly support comprehensive planning like this. And I really applaud the county and RPC for taking this on. I think our comprehensive planning process has been instrumental and really set a vision for the city for many years to come. The one thought, and this is kind of input as we move into the future, is to consider a different way of slicing the pie than perhaps this last document. And that is to look at some things that really rose to the top because maybe 60, 70, 75% of the people seem to like them, but they also had some opposition. And so there might be a way to slice the pie where you say, here's something that rose to the top where a majority of people really seem to want this, and here's a specific formulation of the opposition to that. So that, because I kind of, as I was reading this, thought, I didn't think about the lacking experts. I think that I did see that in some of the committees, but there were a politically diverse county, and I saw in the paper that when, you know, this would rise to the surface, then the chamber would organize, or this would rise to the surface, and the Farm Bureau would organize, and they wanted to have a stake, and they wanted to have a say, et cetera. And so, in some ways, there's something that happens when you lop off the ends. I mean, there's this fantasy that somehow we'll have nonpartisan politics, which is one of the things in here, like, well, actually, we're really diverse in how we think about things, and parties are one way in which we organize those thoughts. So I think that in looking through this and trying to gestate it, I would strongly suggest that the listening audience go to the website because there's a lot of information there. I would suggest that the city council, as we think about how to incorporate this information and what we're doing, also try to maybe slice the pie differently. And I personally think that this does not show us what the conversations were like, and that you really have to dig into the materials and look at some of the more specific things that rose to the surface and some of the specific concerns that responded without necessarily kind of lopping it off and just going with the things that lack insert opposition, because most of the innovation historically everywhere in this country has come from leadership and people having an idea that was not very popular that over time became popular. And so I think sometimes, you know, we have to look at that and see what might have come out of this that's a good idea that might not have full consensus yet.
There is a level at which I think these processes, you know, the granddaddy of visioning projects is Chattanooga, Tennessee. And when people talk about it, they always talk about the aquarium. Well, the aquarium came out of that process because one individual used the process as a platform to sell his personal idea about an aquarium to the community. And so one of the things that we're seeing here is, it may have been the way the process was designed, it may have been the nature of the participation in it, but there didn't seem to be very much of people using the process as a platform to bring these, you know, sort of personal conceptions into the process. So this really is very much a sort of a collective expression, and the personal is not strongly represented in that, I don't think.
So we've learned now that we have a platform, but the statue has yet to be constructed. So there's hope for the future, and creativity still is before us. Thank you for your presentation. I think it's very significant to know about it.
Thank you.
Now we have another presentation offered to us by the Convention and Visitor Bureau of Champaign County. We have public input. Yes. Oh, these are the presenters.
I think Tom's going to give a little intro.
Oh. Okay. All right. So, Tom, do you want to do the first part of this presentation?
Just very briefly, I want to do introductions. As one of the city's representatives to the Champaign County Convention and Visitors Bureau, I work with the staff and the board at the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and they've come and asked to do a brief presentation to you tonight I'd like to introduce Scott Hockman, who is the Executive Director of the Champaign County Convention and Visitors Bureau, and Jeff Edwards, who is the Chair of both the Executive Committee and the Board of Directors, representing the Holiday Inn Express, and the Hotel Motel Association.
Thanks, Tom.
And any other title you want to give them. Mayor Pressing, members of the City Council, the City staff, and ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you for the opportunity that you've given us tonight to speak to you. As we begin our presentation, and it's an informational one at that, allow me to express our sincere thanks for your continued support of the Convention and Visitors Bureau and its affiliated organizations, the Champaign County Arts Council, and otherwise known as 40 North, and the Champaign County Sports Commission. To borrow a line, if I may, from our national and state leaders, the state of tourism in Champaign County is strong. As you can see in the presentation that we gave you last week and you have in front of you, you can see that tourism is economic development, which of course economic growth and development is a key area that you have here for Urbana. We share that goal, and you'll see that tourism is one vehicle that will get you there. As you go through your presentation that we have for you, you will see various success stories and various departments of the Bureau that we represent. And we try to be a comprehensive Bureau in that we represent everything from the leisure travel to meetings and conventions, sports, the arts, group tours, and just about everything else in between, I do believe. Through our resources and the efforts, the various cities here in Champaign County not only realize revenue from the hotel motel taxes that are generated, but each of those individuals who come for business to Champaign County also contribute to your local taxes, such as food and beverage that they buy, gasoline, and other sales taxes on goods and services that they purchase when they're here. We support and participate in many events and activities throughout the year, such as Boneyard, which just completed, and of course I do want to take a moment to applaud 40 North for a fantastic Boneyard again this year. It was one of the best ones that I understand, and of course the weather cooperated perfectly this year, so everyone appreciated that. And of course Sweet Corn Festival here in Urbana is a huge event for your city, and that's also one event that we are pleased to participate and also to support. The Champaign County Convention and Visitors Bureau is affiliated with the Illinois Bureau of Tourism. We are one of 40 bureaus throughout the state whose mission is to promote and market their particular area to a variety of individuals, event planners, meeting planners, sports associations, artists, motor coach travelers, and of course, the leisure travel. We do this through a variety of methods, and as we have in our presentation, you'll see that, as I mentioned earlier, that it's meetings and conventions, group travel, sports, arts, and various other entities that we are involved in. And we are involved in a big competition, as a matter of fact, when you look at other communities in central Illinois. And I'm proud to say that the last figures that we had from 2005, the 2006 numbers will be available this summer, showed that in Champaign County alone, $217 million was spent on tourism for 2005. That was a 6% increase over the previous year, and we're hoping to do at least that for 2006, if not more, as far as a percentage increase. Also, as those numbers indicate, tourism is a huge payroll incentive here for the area. $49 million was spent on payroll directly related to the tourism industry in 2005. Our Bureau is able to represent our various communities at meetings, conferences, and trade shows through the utilization of grants that are available to the visitors bureaus. And I do want to take a moment to specifically call your attention, whenever you are on the web, to our website, www.visitchampaigncounty.org. Through one of those grants last summer, we were able to relaunch our website, and it is the first multilingual website in the entire state when it's talking about tourism bureaus. We're even first as opposed to Chicago, which I really like whenever you're talking about the tourism industry. We have 15 different languages that are available through every portion of the website. So the appeal has been tremendous. We have seen a quadrupling of visits and hits to our website, and we are very happy that that portion of the Bureau is showing growth, and it's also showing our diversity here in Champaign County with all the various individuals that work and go to school here. Also, I do want to add that our website, which we're very proud of, was named Best in the State at the Illinois Governor's Conference earlier this spring in Chicago. That was over 80 websites that were submitted, and I'm very pleased with my staff for putting that together. I could not sit here tonight and not acknowledge also two of our affiliated organizations, 40 North Arts Council and the Champaign County Sports Commissions. We are unique in that we have these two segments of the Visitors Bureau, which are vital, and they present added opportunities and resources as we highlight the various cities and the county that make it stand above the rest. And as I said earlier, 40 North had a tremendous success with Boneyard, and we're looking forward to helping it grow and continue to see it succeed in our many years to come. One project that the Bureau undertook this past year, and it was something that was communicated to me as I was taking the job, was a strategic plan process. And I'm very happy to report that through a lot of efforts and a lot of sweat and tears, we have finalized, or in the process of finalizing, a strategic plan for the Bureau, which lays out goals for 1, 3, and 5 years down the road. A very clear path to that, some very aggressive goals, but ones that we feel are achievable, and whenever we put the finishing touches on that, we will circulate that to your council and also to others throughout the cities. And as I said, it lays out a very comprehensive look at what we want to do and how we want to get there, which of course is very vital for our organization or any organization, as you well know. The Council's continued support of the Bureau, which, as I said, we very much appreciate, will ensure Champaign County ranks among the top bureaus in Illinois, thus making it a destination of choice. And that is what we're striving for, is a destination of choice in all segments of the tourism industry. We encourage and welcome your participation and attendance at our board meetings and also at our Bureau events. And we've seen some of you there, and we encourage all of you from time to time to make an effort to come. And I'll end right there at the moment and ask for any questions from the
Thank
Council.
you very much. Are there questions from the commission or committee? Yes, Danielle.
I'm the person who asked the first question tonight. Thanks for your presentation. I have a question, which is, I know that there have been some changes that the CVB has undergone in the last handful of years, and I'm just wondering if you could, maybe this speaks to your strategic plan, which I haven't seen. It sounds like it's going to come out soon, to talk about how you see the CVB has changed in recent years and what you see the kind of current emphases or focus is. Like, kind of what is the executive summary, so to speak, of your strategic plan?
If you don't mind, I'll let Mr. Edwards answer that since he has the background.
I think that the Bureau itself has changed in the past few years, and I know that Mr. Walden has been a participant as well. It has undergone some changes through leadership and also staffing. I believe that the direction that we're going now is a direction that will increase not only tourism, but it'll increase occupancies for the hoteliers in the county as well. I mean, do you have anything you want to add to that? I mean,
the one comment that I would add to that is that what you have with our existing staff is a dedicated professional organization, and we are committed to making, as I said earlier, Champaign County a premier destination here in Central Illinois. We realize that we have some hurdles to overcome and also some things that need to be put in place to do that. But I can tell you that our staff is extremely dedicated and very talented, and we're very pleased with who we have on board at this point.
I would like to add that I don't believe in the past that with the strategic plan that we have, I think that it gives a lot more direction as to where we need to go, how we need to get there, and it's very specific. So I think it's certainly going to enhance the process.
So you're saying that the main focus is folks from outside making this a destination and filling hotels. Like, is that kind of the executive summary, is really focused on recruitment outside, folks outside the county, or what would you say kind of embodies the strategic plan that you're working on?
That's one of the segments that we address, but we also want to be very cognizant of our local citizens, to make them aware of what the county has and to introduce them to various segments, hopefully, that they know about but they have never participated in. And we had to meld the two together to make a plan that addresses both, and at the same time has goals that are very reachable and achievable. And we can do that at least locally through press releases and through newspaper stories and television stories and various other local events like that. We can concentrate not only on the outsiders, but we do want our local people to be proud of what we have here in these communities.
Other comments? I know when I first arrived in Champaign County, I first started driving around to find out how flat was Flatville. And other important, I had to drive to Farmers, no, it's not in Champaign County, but I had to drive to Farmers City because of its name. And other places too intrigued me. And I understand that that part of the scope that potentially could come out was that people who basically stay in the urban areas might rediscover some of the rural wonders of our county, the curious places, the peculiar histories, or the crumbling foundations, or whatever it might be out there that you are sending people to pay notice of. So hopefully that will become something that we'll all enjoy, as well as those who are arriving by jet plane from St. Louis or New York City to do some business in Champaign County. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay. This brings us to an actual ordinance within the agenda of the City Council committee meeting tonight. And Brandon, do you want to give a presentation first and talk a little bit about bicycle workshop?
Very briefly, I just wanted to let the council members and the community know about a bike workshop here. If I can turn on the Elmo so people at home can see. I don't see it up on the screen, but okay, we have help coming. A lot of you may know that we've budgeted as a city for a bike master plan process, and that's starting. One of the most important things that we have coming up is a public workshop, where we really need people from every neighborhood in Urbana to come to the public workshop. When they come in the door, we're going to actually hand them a map of the city of Urbana and a marker and tell them to show us on the map what roads they use that are safe, what intersections need to become more safe, where they would like safer bicycling facilities to be. And we take all those maps and use those to help decide which streets we study in the project and which streets we get to make some improvements in. You might have noticed on Friday's paper there was a story, Cities Coming Up with Plans for Peddlers. In the Friday News Gazette, if you missed it, you can still check it out online or find a copy of the News Gazette in your library. And there have been advertisements around town about the public workshop. This is a picture of the flyer, and I will briefly, let's see if I can get it a little bigger. I'll briefly tell you about it. This public workshop is 10 days from now. It is May 3rd. That is a Thursday, a week from Thursday, at the Urbana Middle School in the cafetorium, which you can easily find entering from the door off the parking lot. The address there is 1201 South Vine. If you haven't been to the middle school, I know some people who are part of the university community haven't. So Thursday, May 3rd, we hope people come out from 6 to 8 p.m. It's a 2-hour event, and we really ask that people come to the whole 2 hours. It's a structured program with some different parts. You don't want to miss the part where we give you the map and the marker and you draw your desired picture of Urbana's bicycling network. We're going to do that. We're going to let people comment about bicycling conditions, give them a chance to learn more about the planning process and find out how to stay involved. We're also asking people to RSVP. So talk to all your neighbors, talk to people in every part of the city, talk to your friends and coworkers, because we would like people to RSVP so we have an idea of how many folks will come out. If you don't RSVP, though, you're still welcome to come. So anybody who bikes in Urbana or is interested in biking safety in Champaign County is welcome. Even if you didn't RSVP, please come out on Thursday, May 3rd. Are there any questions from council members?
Anybody have comments or questions for Brandon?
Okay.
I'm trusting that your presentation is going to inspire a lot of people to mark their calendars.
Yes, I hope so. Thursday, May 3rd from 6 to 8, we hope to see you all at the middle school and take this big step towards safer biking in Urbana. Thank you.
Okay, and the mayor has a question for Brandon.
Oh,
Is it okay to walk?
you are allowed to walk to the
Okay.
meeting. Yeah, we won't be checking you at the door. You're very welcome to walk.
My 10-speed pedal master is in the garage, ready to go.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. All right, and I'm sorry, I actually was reading a version of our agenda that was actually a day or two old, and Brandon's presentation, I know, is part of the new revised agenda. This does bring us to an ordinance now concerning parking on certain streets, Race Street. Public Works? Mr. Gray?
Any questions?
What have you to say?
I move to send it to council.
Second.
Any discussion?
I mean, I go into it.
All right,
For the purposes of the audience, you should say what it is.
All right.
we're on Race Street, Mr. Gray.
Traffic Commission met recently and talked about some operational matters on Race south of Florida Avenue. And we've studied the location, and we need to extend the northbound left turn lane a little further. But that process need to prohibit parking further. And we met with our notified area residents and talked to them, and we recommend a further restriction, no parking, and extension of the left turn bay by 50 feet for the northbound, no left turn lane on Race south of Florida.
All right.
My motion is to send this to council with the recommendation for approval.
Okay. Motion by Charlie, seconded by Danielle. Discussion about this important change in Race Street parking. Seeing none, should we call a vote? Or is it by voice vote? Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that is forwarded to council. All right. This brings us to a discussion item, which has been has received a little bit of attention recently. It is a discussion of historic preservation incentives. And community development is going to lead off the commentary with a review of current incentives, I think.
Hello. My name is Rebecca Bird. It's the first time I've been here. I'm a planning intern, and I've been working on this memo. The memo in front of you describes the incentives that are in place currently and also gives examples of what some other communities are doing in Illinois, and also one of them is from another state. There are also several brochures with your memo. The first two, although yours I think are not in color, sorry, yours are photocopied. These describe the federal and state incentives, and then the others are all brochures from the city. The first one explains historic preservation in Urbana, and then the other three are actually walking tours, so different walking tours. This one describes the local landmarks and districts, and also the National Register listed properties in Urbana. This one is a walking tour of downtown, and this one is of the West Main Street area. And on page 2 of the memo, there's a flow chart that explains the financial incentives. Oh, sorry. So the state incentives are for owner-occupied properties, and that's the property tax freeze. And in that, local property taxes are abated. It applies to local landmarks and also National Register listed properties. It applies to single-family owner-occupied residences, as well as condos and small apartment buildings, as long as the owner does live in the apartment building. And the owner needs to spend at least 25% of the property's market value on the rehab. For income-generating properties, there are federal tax credits. There's a 20% tax credit that applies only to properties that are listed in the National Register, and it also is only for properties that are commercial, industrial, agricultural, or rental residential. There's also a 10% tax credit. That one's a little bit different. It's for properties that are built before 1936 but are not historic, so they would not be listed on the National Register, and nor would they be locally landmarked. And they also do not apply to residential properties, rental residential included. That does not apply for the 10% tax credit. Also in the city, there are several programs that are not specifically geared to historic preservation, but that can be applied to historic preservation. One is the Downtown Tax Increment Financing District, and the other is the city's redevelopment incentive loan and grant program. And then also, aside from financial incentives, the MOR district is another way in which the adaptive reuse of historic properties is encouraged in the city. And then the last section in the memo is about examples from other communities. And we did look for examples that were not related to an investment in the property, but simply to having a property landmarked, and couldn't find any examples of that. Most of the programs apply to both residential and non-residential properties, and the local incentives we could find are either grant or loan programs, and also property tax incentives. So they're in Bloomington and Plainfield, Illinois. They both have grant programs which apply to residential and non-residential. In Eugene, Oregon, they have a loan program which is residential or commercial. In Chicago, they have a property tax incentive. That's actually for Cook County, and it only applies to commercial or industrial use. And they also have a building fee permit waiver, which applies to both commercial and residential landmarks. And then in Carbondale, Illinois, there's another loan program. Any questions? I'd imagine Robert would be the one you'll direct your questions to.
Well, I failed to introduce Rebecca Bird. She's our new planning intern. She's been with us for a couple months now. It's a wonderful job. We're lucky to have her. And Rebecca, one of her previous jobs, she worked for the University of Illinois, and specifically worked in historic preservation for the campus, in terms of the campus. So it's an area that she has an interest in and knowledge about.
But we welcome you to our staff.
Thank you.
Does anybody have a question on the presentation at this point?
It's about the general subject, not necessarily the presentation.
Well, I think we could open it up. Yes, Mayor?
When you list these various cities, do they ever provide sort of before and after statistics so you can see how effective these programs are?
Some of them do.
Okay.
Some of them do. I don't actually have any of that here, but some of them did. The majority of them didn't, but there were at least 2 programs that had at least some comment on what it's done in their community.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and Lynn?
Rob, I think this is for you. On the surface, this seems to, and I know, Dennis, you got some ideas out there, and, like how to, we could incent people. It seems like a pretty darn good idea. I mean, I'm trying to think, what are the negatives to this? And there must be some that are kind of significant, or maybe we would have done it years ago. The comment that was made earlier this evening that, gosh, finally, it's on the agenda. Is it just the issue that you get into with ownership? And I mean, but we're not forcing this on anyone. It's an opportunity for people to take advantage of. And the downside, of course, for the city is that it would cost us something in terms of tax dollars. But what else? What am I missing that might be critical here that has not had us do this in the past?
in terms of the incentives?
Yeah,
Possible
and just
incentives?
other negatives that I'm, what else, what's out there that's...
You're asking why this is has historic preservation
Yeah,
stalled?
I mean, this seems,
Well, I guess there's two different questions. One is, why aren't people designating or applying to designate more landmarks? And then the other question is just about the incentives itself. I think the incentives that are suggested are incentives along these lines are a good idea. They honestly, some of it may be more symbolic than providing the dollars necessary to do rehab work, but I think it's does show people that the city stands behind landmark nomination, the concept of historic preservation.
right.
For example, some of the numbers provided by Councilmember Roberts.
Right, it's really minimal. I mean, it's definitely money, but it's not like a big contribution to, a $50,000 or 150, a significant renovation.
Right, $1,600 over 5 years, for instance.
Right.
But I have seen cases where people really take note. It gets their attention. The city provides a certain incentive for historic preservation, and then people perk up their ears and they say, that's really kind of provocative for some
But-
people.
So that's the positive. But
Right.
Is there any negative to this? Anybody?
Well, that's an open question that we can have a discussion about.
That's what I was hoping.
All right. And maybe what I should do is I wonder if I should just kind of briefly talk about what I'm suggesting and perhaps why. Would that be appropriate? I mean, this has actually been distributed, and you've read it pretty well. And, my basic interest in it is that I've observed that while we have a really excellent historic preservation ordinance, it hasn't received very much activity. And we have had some achievement, and there are some landmarked homes, and we do have a historic district. And with the number of houses in Urbana that are probably 125 years old or 100 years old, one would think that there could be whole streets that one might see as being historic nominated. But it does seem that basically any input or impulse to do so is totally altruistic. You have a concept that historic nature of Urbana is important to you, and therefore for altruistic reasons you will say so and actually nominate your own home to be one such designated property. Well, the fact is that we've seen people who have live in historic homes hesitate to do so, and the perception is that there are reasons that create hindrances to changes that might be required of their home. Perhaps they don't like the idea of getting a certificate of appropriateness, and they're not sure what that is, but it sounds terrible, and why would I bother? And so we find that, and I am told by members of the Historic Preservation Commission that people who actually promote historic preservation in the community, and might even be members of PACA or some other such organizations, have failed to even designate their own homes. And so I'm thinking, well, if there's this huge impediment to even caring to go that far, is there any way of removing the initial impediment? Because you see, once you do designate a home as a historic landmark, then in the future, should that house perhaps need renovation or some structural correction or something, there will be funds available to that person through state and federal fundings to actually proceed and help defray the expenses. And that's a very positive, good thing. But if a homeowner is never going to initiate the process to actually declare their house historic in some kind of a formal sense in the city, it doesn't matter whether the house is in excellent shape or needs work. We're not going to have if we can't get them to nominate and register their houses, we basically don't have historic homes in the city of Urbana. So my suggestion is how to sweeten the pot and get things started. And you've seen here, I've got 3 suggestions. One is to mirror the Build Urbana program. And I think talking with the council members and the staff, it seems to be the most troublesome and have a problem of involving a lot of different taxing bodies to carry it forth, and I'm thinking it's probably not the way to go. The second scenario is a flat percentage of the city's share of property taxes. And you have to recall that the city's share of property taxes in Urbana is only 16% of the pie, that there's other larger players, the school system, the Parks Division, and others, MTD, who get the other, I don't know, 23 or 4%, no, it's not, 74% of the property tax, even more than that, it's 80-something. I'm not good with math, okay, but anyways, the large share of it would be through other, would not be affected in any way if we only reduced the property taxes based on the city's rate. And then my final point was how to find additional funding. And I thought that it would make the most sense to take that process, which is probably the most endangers historic homes, and that is the demolition of houses, and convert any kind of fees that we earn or for the permitting of that demolition process in the city to be collected, and a portion of that put aside as a fund to help, to earmarked actually for incentives, for historic preservation, for programs that would help keep the housing stock that might be at risk in our city, and otherwise fund improvements or educational processes. So those are my 3 suggestions to talk about. Yes, Mayor.
I think that your third suggestion has sort of a poetry to it, but I don't think it's really new money, which would be a concern unless we want to demolish more buildings, which I don't think we want to do. But I like looking at Eugene, Oregon. They have a revolving fund, so people pay it back, and I think that's an incentive that doesn't really cost the city a lot of money. So I think we should look into that, see how that works.
Anybody else with comments? Charlie Smythe.
I like the idea of waiving permits as another one to help people get going. But I think, you know, the one thing I find interesting is that, I don't know where this one came from, the current incentives to place property. There are no incentives to get you started. And I think that's what Dennis is after, is what can we do to get people started down the path. And once they're started down the path, there are lots of other things that can help. And of course, a question I've got for us to ask, the same one I asked Brian earlier, is, you know, we've got all these programs, how do we get people started down this path? And I think that's the biggest issue before us.
Lynn.
I presume once a house is designated as a historic landmark, it stays on the list. Can you ever get it off?
I mean, after it's designated, in terms of financial incentives, or in terms of just designation?
Just designation.
Yes. Yeah, it can be de-designated, whether it's a local landmark or if it's a national.
You know, for example, if it, say someone this year did this, put a lot of money into it, totally made it look great, neighborhood's happy, 30 years down the road, it falls apart, changes owners, new owners don't do anything with it, it truly becomes unrehabable. And so, would there be a barrier there for resale, to tear it down because it's a historic landmark? Yes, correct?
Well, the ones that have been de-designated are, it's rare, but it sometimes happen. For instance, if there's a fire, tornado, if it's essentially destroyed for some reason, and it's not salvageable, and then the property would be de-designated.
but not just if it was in significant disrepair.
If it's in significant disrepair, there's a process, for instance, like if it's a local landmark and they apply to tear it down, they could do so with a certificate of appropriateness from the Landmark Commission. And if the Landmark Commission denies that, they can apply for something called a certificate of economic hardship, which means that we realize that it's a historic landmark, but it's in terrible condition, it's not economically feasible, and here's some numbers that we have, here's the repair costs that we got.
So there are ways around
Right.
that if it becomes that type of situation, which really doesn't help the neighborhood like we would want it to.
Brandon.
Yeah, in response to these ideas you put together, Dennis, thank you for looking into it, and I thank staff for helping to get you some numbers and flesh this out, and for the research on the other cities. I'm comfortable at this point with looking into number 2, the opportunity to do some sort of tax reduction. That program seems very reasonable to me. I think that we're already spending money on historic preservation by keeping the commission running, by having all these programs. They're just not getting used, and we already have revenue from demolitions that I think it makes some sort of sense to set aside and use in this way. One of the questions when I read staff's memo that it sort of begged was, well, shouldn't we do these things that the other cities do? Shouldn't we have incentives when people fix up their home if they do a certain amount of repairs? Shouldn't that be the time that we give incentives, rather than just giving the incentive at the point of designating a landmark? And to me, I think it really makes sense to give some incentive at the point of designating a landmark. There's no encouragement at that step of the process. That's a big gap where it's a big hurdle for people to get over. It's a lot of work. It's difficult to do. And yet when you do it, there's no reward. You are eligible for some things maybe later on down the line in the future, but that's not enough of an immediate reward to make it interesting enough to go through the process. So even though staff's memo sort of seemed to suggest to me, let's have these sort of grant loan programs like other cities do, I'm interested in this sort of example that you brought forward, Dennis, in actually giving people a benefit just for a nomination. And of course there are further programs then that we encourage them to take advantage of, to actually use a grant and use a loan to rehab the facade and improve the property. But I'm comfortable that we might move ahead and look into number 2.
Danielle.
Yeah, in looking at this, these series of proposals, the one that I support the most is number 3, and I'd actually say that we should have a bigger pool than $6,000 over 4 years. That seems really tiny. So something more like 80%, everything but the actual cost of the staff signing off on the permits, etc., could go to some kind of fund that, and maybe there's other fund resources other than just demolitions. That would be another way to expand it. But something on the level of some thousands of dollars per year, like $5,000 a year or something, that would be available. And one of the things, to respond to what Brandon said, is that we could have someone fill out the application before they nominate their house, and staff could, or the commission could even vote, or staff could say, you qualify for this, and therefore, if you designate your home, you're kind of pre-qualified for this particular grant. The other thing, the thing in particular I like about number 3 is that we want people to rehab and repair homes. I don't, except for getting a plaque sitting next to a house that's in really good shape, that's historic, I don't think we get a whole lot other than the plaque. And so we could just start giving out some plaques and let people know what the history of particular homes that are in stellar shape are. What I think that we need is to prevent demolition, support rehab and repair, and support reuse, as well as preserving history and educating about that history. And I don't see number 2 doing any of the top 3 of those 4 items. In addition, I'm concerned with limited budgets in funding potentially wealthy people with $500,000 homes that are historic, where they don't really need that tax break. And I don't think that we get enough from it to give that tax break. So we have to think about all kinds of homes, not just a tiny little cottage, you know, in a particular part of town, but the big mansions too that, you know, some of the things on Florida Avenue in Pennsylvania. So with that said, the other thing I would say is that I still think that this goes hand in hand with something about neighborhood conservation, and we'll be seeing more of that, because we need to figure out some way of slowing down and preventing demolitions. Honestly, the most important step that the city of Urbana took for historic preservation was downzoning West Urbana, which was politically very difficult. Bernadine Stake was part of leading that charge. That has saved more homes, because you go to Champaign in neighborhoods where there's lots and lots of multifamily homes next to historic single-family homes because they didn't downzone. And there's a huge incentive to knock out a small property and put an apartment building if the zoning designation on that land is high. So, you know, this isn't the magic bullet necessarily for doing historic preservations as nominations. I really feel like that's a small piece of getting at the goals that we have, but I do think it's a piece, and I do support some kind of incentive that would come in the forms of grants and maybe no interest loans. And I don't think it has to be a lot of money. I think if people think that there's $2,500 available to help with a $10,000 painting job, because that's what it costs to paint these historic homes. I just got a quote the other day. It's really, I won't be painting my house for a while because I can't afford it. But you know, that would be significant. And paint jobs are one of the main ways in which that wood siding is preserved. So, in addition, I think that this funding should just be for exterior things. Shouldn't be for interior.
Thank you. Mayor.
You talked originally about having plaques and identifying homes. We had a discussion about that. I think there's a value to that, which is education. But it seems to me that from what Bryan Adams said, that the biggest barrier is the months and months of research on determining what is a historic building. I wondered if we can perhaps maybe get some assistance. Are there students at the university that are interested in doing that kind of research?
Sure
we could have workshops to get people started on, you know, what needs to be done. But I think it's kind of fun to go looking through historic documents. But I bet there are people that would help if we could get it organized.
Can I make a comment about that?
Of course.
Okay, so you have an intern who is either partly paid by the city through grant money, or maybe you're asking for them to do it for free, I don't know, to do this very difficult work for finding out about the history of various homes. And then they do, and then so what? The property owner gets their little information that's been, took 6 months to find out. And they get the information that they have a home that's, for whatever reason, significant, and they just put it in a folder on their mantle, and that's all that happens. And that's all that has happened, really. And I mean, as a matter of fact, the historic research is one of the giant detriments toward taking the step to have your house nominated for historic landmarking, because if it's not in a district that's been all-inclusive, you actually have to prove that you have to have the awareness to be able to prove to the Historic Preservation Commission that either your house has got significant artistic details, was something historic happened at it, was done by a famous architect or something. There has to be proof, and I'm not seeing the fact that that even after the research might be done, that there is any motivation to actually take the next step. Yes. Robert, did you have a comment? Okay, great. Any other comments in this discussion? Okay, Charlie.
Oh, Robert actually had something you wanted to say first.
Well, that's okay. Go ahead. No, well, I just, before I forgot, Lynn, your question in the beginning was about negative aspects, and I probably should bring up, depending on how assertive incentives are, you might, if you have incentives that are real incentives that are really assertive, You might get applications that are not necessarily qualified. You might get kind of a rush of applications. I'll give you an example. I was on a statewide board, preservation board in Missouri. I was on the board of directors, and I was the head of the facade easements committee, where people donated facade easements. In return, they got a federal tax break. We got all kinds of applications for facade easements they wanted us to take on and to hold on to it and administer it, et cetera. Some of them were fantastic buildings. Other ones, honestly, weren't all that great. But that incentive was enough to get a lot of applications. In part, that was because it was a pretty assertive incentive. But I think what you've been discussing tonight is pretty modest, so that may not necessarily get you a flood of applications, for instance, people that want some sort of property tax relief or something like that. That's just an initial assessment that I've been thinking about.
And Charlie?
We'd asked for some feedback from the Historic Preservation Commission, and we, after meeting with them, threw a bunch of ideas around. Where are we in that process? Do we have anything coming from them on ways of helping out? There was discussion there of using U of I students to help out, but I don't know what came of those discussions. And I think you were there that night. Maybe you remember what we sort of agreed to do.
I'm not sure that.
In terms of U of I students, Alice Novak, who's the chair, she teaches the class at the university each year, and her students have been doing surveys for years. We've been talking more recently about her students doing actual nominations. We talked about the fact that it would need to be done in conjunction with property owners who would be interested in that sort of having their properties nominated as a local landmark, and not running in a situation that you talked about, Dennis, where all that wonderful research is done and they say thanks very much and that's it. So it need to be done carefully with people who have an inclination already towards designation of landmarks.
Well, Brandon?
Yeah, two comments. First, briefly, Danielle, to sort of refute what you said, I really feel like when people submit their property and have it designated as a landmark, that is a big step, that they are giving up something, which is that they are making a written commitment to go through that process with the Historic Preservation Commissioners, who are the experts, to go through that process to come and get a certificate of appropriateness when they make changes to the facade, to the exterior. And that's a big thing to give up. Now, there's a lot of myth and a lot of, I think, fear about it, which is not justified, because really it's a pretty simple process. You know, when you want to paint the outside of your house, when you want to replace windows, take down the shingles, it's really actually easy. You come in, you fill out a form, we help you through it. But given the myth and the fear, I think they really are giving up something at that step, and that at that step it does make sense to give people some incentive or some help to get over that hurdle, because it's a hard hurdle, and they're giving up something, and the citizens get something in return, which is the commitment from all of those people who have designated landmarks, the commitment that when they're going to make changes, they come to our commission and they talk with the experts about how to make them in a sensitive way. So I think, to me, that does have a lot of value. My second comment is actually a question for staff. We've talked a lot about the tax incentive issues and the funding, but education really is half, if not more, of this ballgame. Have you seen examples from other cities of their education and their outreach plans to teach neighbors about, all the things that are available, to have a neighborhood meeting where you give them the application and tell them how they can fill it out and hook them up with a U of I student who will help them do the paperwork, and to have an education program with the public about it? Have you seen good examples, or have you started thinking in your own minds about what an education program would look like if we created one?
I think there are several programs with workshops that cities fund on starting the process of researching your house, and things like the applications for the Elm Street nominations. Those are much more detailed than they needed to be, and that was because they were very involved in the process, but an applicant wouldn't need to go to that level of detail. So it is work, and it would require time, but having some type of a workshop would be one way of starting the process. Other than that, the Rock Island has iPod walking tours and I think there's also a cell phone function that you can phone in and get a description as you're walking through a tour of houses.
Rockford, I think Rockford.
No, I think it's Rock Island.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, Robert?
I think Brandon kind of hit it on the head when he said education was a key. I think there's a number of ways we could work into incentives and give people an opportunity, a first-time opportunity to get something. But it seems like my experience has been in historical preservation. It is complicated. If you get federal designation, there's all kind of requirements. And I think that's what people shy away from. If some way we could take the edge off of that, the stigma of once you got it, you're stuck. We need to take the edge off in terms of how difficult it might be to go there. I have first-hand experience with federal guidelines, and I know that it can be difficult. But at the levels we're talking about, a first level, I'll say a lower tier level, a middle tier level, then the state level, and then the federal level. If we could make it, educate people at this lower level on how to deal with it so they could be prepared for this potential onslaught of requirements later on, would be a key. I think that's why people don't pay a whole lot of attention to it, because they have this fear about what they're getting themselves hooked into, and it's not really getting hooked into it. It's just a matter of execution, actually.
Okay, maybe I'm going to speak on the topic. I mean, okay, I feel like definitely I'm a proponent. I would like to see the city really embrace historic preservation initiatives. Right now, we've passed an ordinance. The Historic Preservation Commission often cancels their meeting due to lack of activity. They go through, they may cancel their meetings for 3 months in a row. Nothing's being brought to them. So you look at the situation, you say, well, what's wrong? Certainly, of course, education is going to play a part. And they actually have a commitment to educational facilities, or to create workshops. That's part of their calling. And they have provided us with the brochures that we've been holding up that explain what the designation process requires and what you get for it. People really need to realize that, what we're looking at here, I'm not talking about federal programs. I'm not talking about state programs. Those are in place, and you can get funds for those. When you do a renovation, and if you spend about $5,000 or more, there's a certain level where it clicks in. But there are a lot of houses here in town that aren't in terrible shape, but they are historic. Now we have passed a stronger basic building maintenance ordinance that requires people to keep the buildings and the structures and the utilities and things like that stronger and more defined. So it doesn't seem to me that there's going to be a house that goes on as a historic landmark that, as Lynn was suggesting, then the owner sits on it for 20 years, it deteriorates, and then what do you have? Well, actually, we already had that situation today. We've had people sitting on their houses for 25 years without repairing them at this very moment. Now, if we don't put our money where our mouth is in some way, what can we say that the city locally, as a local municipality, has done for historic preservation? Now, we have passed an ordinance, but we don't supply any funds to any step or level of historic preservation at all, and we're afraid even to do the most modest kind of thing. I mean, we're saying I'm not even willing to initiate anything that's going to cost the city any money. It has to be free, or somebody else has to pay for it. And I think that's chicken. If we can spend, $75,000 or $100,000 on having a test of the aquifer to find out if our drinking water is safe, I think we could probably spend $3,000 a year supporting historic preservation initiatives. But if we can't, I'll be dumbstruck, and I'll be, it'll be something. It'll be a learning experience for me. I think that the next step, I really think personally that the idea of using demolition funds for historic preservation is well inspired. I think it's a darn clever thing to do. You take the thing that you're most afraid of, losing the houses, and convert some of those funds right into preservation techniques. And it doesn't have to be all of it. I said 40%. I thought that was, generous enough, and it would cover administrative costs. If Danielle is willing to raise the ante to 80% of those funds being turned into historic preservation uses, I am totally willing to go with that. She blew my mind. And I think that that's something very appropriate. I think that's the kind of attitude that would really make us take a leap here. We have some significant homes that are about to be lost through lack of activity and lack of action. And if we lose the ones on Elm Street, well, that's this year. What will we lose 2 years from now when something else is falling apart and when the property owner is not interested in doing the landmarking? And I think I'm trying to address that very question. If across the street from me at 210 Grove Street, we just found out that we have a home designed for a widow by Joseph Royer, the premier architect in our town. And if the house has gone through a series of owners in the last 5 years, it is a rental property at this point. And potentially, and when a city inspection personnel came through, suggested to the owner that, well, why fix it? Why don't you just tear it down? And since it's in a R5, it's an R4 or R5 district, if it was torn down, it wouldn't be a duplex. It could be a 7-plex or 6-plex or 10-plex apartment building. Have we actually fulfilled our duty to save the historic nature of our history? This really comes to my mind when I find out that the man who owns the house is a member of PACA and has restored his own personal house. But he's not willing to register his home as a historic landmark. So I'm trying to think of, well, how could we initiate or facilitate that process? Charlie, that's my rant. Okay,
actually, Dennis, in answer to your question, the same thing that was done in the West Urbana neighborhood that was discussed earlier, and saved much of West Urbana, needs to be done to your neighborhood. So the question for Robert is, where are we on the rezoning issues in the East Urbana neighborhood? Or Libby's here too, I guess. And then I have a motion.
Adjusting, because of a loss of our planner too, we're doing reassignments. And so that project has been reassigned to another staff member. And Rebecca here will be working on the Lincoln-Busey corridor, and Jeff Engstrom will be working with Historic East Urbana. So those initiatives are proceeding. I did want to respond a little bit on the education comments, and my direct history with historic preservation in Urbana is 7 years old, so a little longer, but we have done an awful lot in this time period. So I really don't want us to sell ourselves short. Every year we've held a major event. We are a certified local government. Just in fact, tonight I signed a grant from the state, and this will be for our window replacement workshop. So we've received grants on average every year. Rebecca is working along with Anna Hochhalter on a art contest that also involves historic preservation. We've held workshops on how to research your home. We've held walking tours. Some of the brochures are from those. One of the brochures you have was produced with a grant from the state. We have dedicated, and I can speak as CD director, we've dedicated significant staff time to historic preservation every year, and we have always had good qualified staff for historic preservation, and we do now more than ever with 2 experts on staff currently. We've fulfilled all the requirements that the state requires. We have the special requirements for our commissioners to be in different areas of historic preservation. We've had a important effort for West Main Street, was not successful, but there was an awful lot of staff involvement in that. And we have stood ready to assist people and actually complete nomination forms last year. We did do a nomination, and that did not come to pass. So we have made efforts, but the education, of course, is ongoing, and we understand that. But I do want to recognize the hard work of the commission over the last several years and projects coming up, stucco repair, I mean, just all kinds of great topics. And to the extent, we'll continue to produce brochures and put things on the website and alert people. And to the extent that you can engage your constituents, I think we hopefully will have more participation and then more nominations. And if there's an incentive provided, then so much the better. So I think we're all on the right track, but I wanted to recognize the efforts that have been done to date.
Yes, and Charlie, before you make your mind, I just want to make one more comment. Since I talked to my mom, who lives in Detroit, about what I was thinking about doing and all that, she said, "Oh, did you see this article? I'll send you this article in the paper, in the Detroit paper." So I got it a couple weeks ago. The entire village of Pleasant Ridge became a historic landmark city. The entire city just went landmark. Okay, Charlie.
Okay. I think we do have a good education program. We got all these brochures. I think, and it's all good, and not to detract from, but I think what we're saying is that we need to get it out there, better publicity, better known. So it's that aspect of education I think that we're saying needs to be tweaked, or maybe we can come up with some other ideas there. Be it enhancing the city's web pages and getting this out there to make sure that all the neighborhood associations have a link on their web pages or stuff like that. Part of this is getting a presence on not just our own web page, but on those other web pages, that people know that there are programs that exist and they can get the details and so on. So actually, I have a sort of a motion to direct staff here. Lynn perks up her ears like she's had enough, right? Yeah. Let's do something here. Let's do something here. Yeah. So what I would ask is that we motion to direct staff to look at ways of beefing up the education program along the lines that I've just mentioned, to examine a couple of the incentive programs that we've discussed tonight, and put some meat to those bones. Maybe there's one there that stands out above the others. And third thing that I heard, and I actually like, the mayor mentioned it, is this revolving loan program that Eugene, Oregon has, because I think that's another aspect of all this. So it's 3 different pieces of stuff that's already out there, but essentially let's see what we can do to beef up each of these. And so that's my motion.
Second.
There's a second. Okay, if I could speak to the motion. I spoke about education already. I believe we need some kind of incentive, some kind of reward to get people out the door. I think the Historic Preservation Commission needs to be part of this. Get them involved, get the students at the U of I, that partnership we've talked about getting with students at Parkland and U of I, to get them involved in the process. And one thing I don't like, it seems to me that if we have a successful program, we won't be getting money out of demolitions. Granted, there are going to be demolitions around town, so maybe that is a source of some of your money, but I wouldn't make it the only source of your money. And it's sort of like, you increase taxes on cigarettes and alcohol because it provides a disincentive for people to smoke cigarettes and purchase alcohol. They're negatively related. And so it seems like, we don't want to be encouraging demolitions just because it puts money in our program. So I realize the idea is there, but I don't quite buy the philosophy of it. But anyway, I think there are lots of places we can look for incentives and or for the money for the incentives, and I'd like staff to go flesh some of that out. Thank you.
Danielle?
I just want to speak in support of the motion and add some maybe core criteria and see if these are agreed to by council. So in looking at an incentive, I mean, we have A and B, and we can talk about A versus B, but perhaps we could look at the criteria underlying these, and there might be some hybrid of these things. I think the criteria I'd like to see for an incentive, financial incentive program, is simple, meaning it's easy to explain and it takes little staff time. I would speak to number 2 as being very simple. You know, we don't have to collect receipts. It's just a simple tax rebate, et cetera. And it might, I mean, sometimes you get in these situations where you spend as much money on staff time as you do trying to regulate, so to speak, and it might just be easier to give the incentive. The second is I do agree with Brandon and Dennis that we need to incentivize designation, and there is a gap there. The third is to incentivize and support rehabilitation and repair. And then the fourth, that there, even with the incentive program, that there be some kind of education component like a marker or something that comes along with what we're doing, so it's automatically markered, and maybe there's some historical information there. But I do want to speak to something that Dennis said, that perhaps, I mean, Dennis, you seem to typify the majority of council sentiment as we don't want to give a dime to this, we don't want to spend any money. And I disagree with that. I think that a majority of council members, from what I sense, are interested in some kind of incentive, and we just need to do it properly and carefully. I will also speak in support, and I didn't before, to the suggestion by Brandon in the notes that says that if we do some kind of tax reduction, that perhaps we cap it to a reasonable number. I think that's important from a fiduciary responsibility to the city. I also think it's important for what the staff has talked about, which is that it's difficult. Sometimes you get a flood of applicants, and I think that we need some mechanism to weed out applicants when there's something that's kind of a tasty incentive there. And third, I think that when something looks like a scarce resource, people are a lot more interested in it, just from a marketing perspective experience. And I think it's important to make it look like, this is staff time, it's our money, our public money, and therefore we need to be careful with that and make sure that we're incentivizing. So perhaps the way to deal with it is if you are committing to rehab, you get greater points in that kind of application review process for the tax incentive or something like that, so that becomes one of the criteria that kind of helps applicants float to the top.
Yes, Heather.
When we're
Thank you.
talking about tax incentives, I think that it would be important that maybe we look at what the amount of taxes are that we are getting from the homes that could possibly come for historic, for an incentive if they were a historic landmark. I guess I wouldn't want to see someone who, if we have a place that's a mansion and $1 million and we're getting a huge, if we're getting a large amount of money from them in taxes, I would hate to see that, well, they're going to do new, fixes up just to get historic and get a tax incentive. I think that could be a little bit disingenuous as far as what the goal here really is not to get that tax break and more. What the real incentive is for historic preservation. So maybe there could be something in the motion that says, up to a certain point, or, I don't know how you would word it, but.
Yes. Okay, well, it sounds like, are there more input on this? It sounds like we've got a motion that's been seconded and to direct staff to come back with flushed out information concerning at least certain parts of the proposal that I put forward, especially concerning incentives and the list that Danielle had created. I take this as being really a very positive discussion. It's certainly the first we've had apparently on their agenda, and can't be totally the first one. But I didn't come here with the solution. I certainly brought the question, however, and the fact that there might be other funding sources to look into to support our programs that we might adopt I'm totally open to that. I don't know what they will be. I merely was picking income flows that came to the city that basically went to the general fund, and so were not designated to any particular use. So with all this commentary now, I guess we've kind of capped the discussion. Should we take a vote? Those in favor of so addressing historic preservation incentive to direct to staff, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Okay, it passes.
A question here
Yes, sir.
before we adjourn. We have one item we've sent to council for next week. Will we have some other stuff make our meeting worthwhile? We're going to start the budget, or? Ah, okay.
We have commission items coming. Yeah, CD commission, I think, is sending some things. Zoning board has sent some things to you, and plan commission. Will they have anything?
Oh, you have appointment.
But there's things from a couple
There'll be-
commissions.
There'll be a task force appointment, hopefully, for public residential.
Okay. And then Lynn.
I would appreciate if there's an appropriate upcoming meeting that we have a staff report just on general economic development, just kind of where we're at, what are some of the new things that are happening. I'd just be interested in an update. If you guys would agree with that, I'd like to see it on the agenda.
More detailed than we usually get from the monthly
Right.
report? Okay.
Right.
Okay, and then Danielle.
Shoot, I've totally lost my train of thought. Budget. When do we get copies of the budget?
We have to produce one first, and we're in process. There's a lot to do yet, so we might be, we'll be close to being on schedule, the one we gave you, but we might be a week off.
Okay. Seeing no other further business before the committee, I call adjournment.